The dust of Olympia in the year 564 BC did not smell of glory. It smelled of sweat, hot iron, and copper-scented blood. Arrichion of Phegalia was not just a man in that moment. He was a three-time champion, facing the end of his life. His throat was trapped in a crushing stranglehold, his lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come. His opponent, a man whose name history has largely discarded in favor of his victim's legend, was slowly squeezing the consciousness out of him. The crowd of thousands stood in a terrifying, suffocating silence. In any other sport, this would be the end. In boxing, the referee might intervene. In wrestling, the match might be reset. No, in the scamma, the pit of Pankration, there was no reset button. There were only two ways out: submission or death. Arrichion's trainer, standing at the edge of the pit, didn't scream for him to give up. He didn't call for a doctor. Instead, he bellowed a phrase that has echoed through the millennia. What a noble epitaph, not to have conceded at Olympia. Driven by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline and the terrifying social pressure of ancient Greek arete, or excellence, Arrichion didn't tap. He didn't wave his finger to signal defeat. Instead, with his last remaining spark of life, he reached down and violently twisted his opponent's foot, snapping the ankle bones with a sound like a dry branch breaking in a winter forest. The pain was so sudden and so absolute that the opponent raised his hand to the referee, signaling his surrender. Arrichion fell back into the dust, the victor of the Olympic Games for the third time. The only problem was that he was a corpse. His heart had stopped, his neck was likely broken, and he had literally died in the process of winning. The judges crowned his dead body with the laurel wreath. This was not a tragedy to the Greeks. It was the highest realization of their most feared and respected combat system. This was Pankration. Modern mixed martial arts often markets itself as the ultimate form of combat, a return to a primal state of violence. But compared to what happened in the pits of ancient Greece, the UFC is a sanitized, highly regulated ballet. Pankration, a word derived from pan, meaning all, and kratos, meaning power, was exactly what its name implied: total power. It was a sport where the only rules were no biting and no eye gouging, and even those were frequently ignored by the Spartans, who viewed the sport as a direct extension of the battlefield. It was a world where a broken bone was a minor inconvenience, where permanent disfigurement was a badge of honor, and where the curse of the sport lay in the fact that its practitioners were trained to be so lethal that they often found it impossible to live in a peaceful society. We aren't just looking at the history of a game. We are looking at a brutal, ancient technology of the human body that was designed to turn a man into a living weapon, and the terrifying toll it took on those who dared to master it. This is the truth behind the most violent spectacle the world has ever known, a sport that was so dangerous it was eventually banned by empires, only to leave a ghost of its techniques in the DNA of every fight we watch today. The origins of Pankration are not found in the gymnasium, but in the realm of myth. The Greeks believed the sport was co-founded by two of their greatest heroes, Heracles and Theseus. Legend says Heracles used the techniques of Pankration to strangle the Nemean lion when his weapons failed against its impenetrable pelt. Theseus supposedly used it to dismantle the Minotaur in the darkness of the labyrinth. To the Greek mind, this wasn't just fighting. It was the triumph of human intelligence and anatomical leverage over raw, monstrous strength. By the time it was officially introduced to the Olympic Games in 648 BC, it had become the pinnacle of the athletic calendar. While the sprint was for speed and the pentathlon was for versatility, Pankration was for the Andres, the men who were willing to look death in the face for a crown of leaves. To understand why Pankration was so uniquely terrifying, you have to understand the environment of the scamma. This wasn't a ring with soft ropes or a cage with padded floors. It was a dugout pit filled with loose sand, or, more often, mud. The Greeks called the mud fighting version kato pankration, or ground fighting. The introduction of water to the dirt wasn't for the comfort of the athletes. It was to make the bodies slippery, forcing the fighters to develop an incredible level of grip strength and to master the invisible physics of leverage. In a world without gloves, every strike was a naked strike. A punch to the face wasn't a muffled thud. It was a bone-on-bone collision that often resulted in shattered jaws and missing teeth. But unlike boxing, where the fight stopped if a man went down, in Pankration, going to the ground was where the real nightmare began. The curse of the Pankratiast began with their physical appearance. These men were not the lean marble statues we see in modern museums. They were heavy in every sense of the word. They were broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and covered in a layer of functional fat that protected their internal organs from the massive, blunt force trauma of the pit. But the most recognizable mark of a Pankratiast was the cauliflower ear. The Greeks called them kophos, or the blunt-eared ones, because they spent hours every day in korikomakia, training with heavy bags, and in the skyamakia, shadow fighting. Their ears were repeatedly crushed and torn until they became masses of scarred cartilage. To a civilian, these ears were a warning sign of a dangerous individual. To a fellow fighter, they were a resume. A man with smooth ears in the pit was a man who hadn't paid his dues. The training itself was a form of systematic torture. The episkairos, or team games, often turned into violent brawls to build endurance. They used amphoterohis, a technique of grabbing the opponent's hair or fingers to manipulate their balance. While biting was technically illegal, the no biting rule was enforced by a referee holding a long, flexible switch made of a willow branch. If a fighter bit his opponent, the referee didn't pause the match. He simply stepped forward and lashed the fighters with the switch until they separated. This created a paradoxical environment where the athletes were being beaten by the opponent and the referee simultaneously. It forced a level of psychological toughening that is almost impossible to replicate in the modern world. You weren't just fighting a man, you were fighting the pain, the environment, and the law itself. One of the most feared techniques in the ancient arsenal was the gastritsin, or the stomach kick. In modern MMA, a kick to the stomach is a tactical strike. In Pankration, it was a finishing move. Fighters would train to kick with such explosive force that they could rupture internal organs. Because the athletes fought naked and oiled, a kick to the midsection was incredibly difficult to catch or deflect. Another specialized technique was the akrokerismos, the breaking of the fingers. Some fighters, like the legendary Sostratus of Sicyon, earned the nickname Acromeres, or Mr. Fingertips, because his entire strategy involved grabbing the opponent's fingers at the start of the match and systematically snapping them until the man surrendered. It wasn't noble, it wasn't beautiful, but it was 100% effective. Sostratus won 12 titles without ever having to throw a punch or execute a throw, simply by dismantling the opponent's hands. This level of brutality served a very specific purpose in Greek society. It was the ultimate filter for the military. The Spartans, famously, did not allow their citizens to compete in the Olympic Pankration, but not for the reason you might think. They didn't find it too violent. They found the signal for defeat to be beneath a Spartan. In a sanctioned match, a fighter could concede by raising a single finger. For a Spartan, to raise that finger was to admit that he was a slave to pain, a concept that violated the very core of their warrior code. Instead, Spartans practiced a version of Pankration in their own training camps where there was no signaling of defeat. You either won or you were carried out. This highlights the true nature of the sport. It was a simulation of the total war that defined the Greek city-states. When the phalanx broke and the spears were shattered, the battle turned into a chaotic, muddy mess of grappling, gouging, and strangling. Pankration was the science of that chaos. It was the study of how to survive when all the civilized tools of war had failed. However, the curse extended beyond the pit. The men who excelled at this were often viewed with a mix of awe and deep suspicion. They were the Baya, the personification of brute force. Ancient literature is filled with stories of Pankratiasts who couldn't turn off their combat mode. There are accounts of champions who, in a fit of rage at a banquet, accidentally killed guests with a single strike, or who found themselves unable to integrate into the democratic life of the city. They were treated like high-performance weapons that the city-state kept in a box and only opened during the games or during a war. This social isolation created a specific subculture of fighters, men who lived on the fringes of society, obsessed with the kratos, the power that defined their existence. They were the ancestors of the modern professional athlete, but without the multi-million-dollar contracts or the public relations teams to polish their image. They were raw, scarred, and dangerous, and they knew that their glory was as fleeting as the shadow of a cloud over the Olympic Stadium. As the sport evolved, it moved from the raw heroism of Arrichion into a more professionalized, almost gladiatorial phase, where the techniques became even more specialized and the stakes even higher. The transition from a mere struggle into a systematized science of destruction happened in the Horrifying, the dedicated training hall where the Pankratiast was transformed. If the Olympic pit was the stage, the Horrifying was the factory. Here, the athletes engaged in Klimax, or bag fighting. These weren't the foam-filled bags of a modern fitness club. The ancient korikos was a massive hide sack filled with sand, flour, or dried fig seeds. The sandbags were used for building raw, crushing power, while the lighter seed-filled bags were swung like pendulums to train the fighter's reflexes and peripheral vision. A Pankratiast would spend hours standing in the center of several swinging bags, dodging, parrying, and striking until his movements became a blur of instinct. They didn't just hit the bag, they practiced clinching it, treating the heavy sack like a human torso, learning to manipulate a weight that didn't want to be moved. This was the birth of isometric training, using the body's own tension against an immovable object to create a skeletal structure that could withstand the force of a galloping horse. But the most terrifying aspect of their training was the hardening. To prepare for the bone-on-bone reality of the scamma, fighters would strike their shins and forearms against wooden pillars, or thrust their hands into deep pits of coarse river sand. This wasn't just to toughen the skin, it was a systematic attempt to deaden the nerves. A veteran Pankratiast could take a kick to the thigh or a punch to the ribs that would incapacitate an ordinary man, and he wouldn't even blink. His nervous system had been rewired to categorize pain not as a warning, but as a secondary piece of information. This neurological armor made them nearly impossible to stop. In the ancient world, there was a saying, "You can break a Pankratiast's bones, but you cannot break his will." This was the curse in action, the creation of a human being who had voluntarily abandoned the most basic survival instinct of the species, the avoidance of pain. The technical syllabus of Pankration was divided into two distinct worlds, ano, upright, and kato, ground. In the upright phase, the fighter utilized the lactisma, or the kick. Unlike modern kickboxing, which often focuses on the roundhouse, the Greek Pankratiast favored the front kick to the solar plexus and the low shin kick to the knee. These strikes were designed to break the frame. If you could shatter an opponent's kneecap in the first 5 seconds of a match, the rest was merely a formality. However, the true masters of the art were the ground specialists. Once the fight hit the mud, the strangleholds, or ritualized, came into play. The Greeks had identified every major artery and airway in the human neck. They developed chokes that didn't just cut off air, but compressed the carotid arteries to cause a flash knockout. These were the ghost chokes, techniques so subtle that the crowd often didn't realize the fight was over until one man simply went limp. One of the most brutal rituals of the sport occurred during a draw or a match that had lasted for hours under the blistering sun. If the judges saw that neither man could gain the upper hand, they would call for the climax, the ladder. This was essentially a legalized execution. The two fighters would stand face to face, and a coin would be tossed. The winner of the toss got to deliver a single, undefended strike of his choice to the other man. The victim had to stand perfectly still, hands behind his back, and take the blow. If he survived and remained standing, he got to return the favor. This would continue until one man was dead or unconscious. It was the ultimate test of arete, excellence, and carteria, endurance. It turned the sport into a game of biological Russian roulette. There are accounts of men having their ribs driven into their hearts or their skulls crushed by a single, focused palm strike during a climax. It was the moment where sport ended and sacrifice began. As the Roman Empire expanded and eventually swallowed the Greek world, Pankration underwent a dark evolution. The Romans, with their insatiable appetite for munera or blood games, found the Greek version of the sport a bit too athletic. They wanted more carnage. While the Greeks fought bare-handed to emphasize skill and leverage, the Romans introduced the caestus, a leather hand wrap that was often studded with lead weights or iron spikes. In Roman-era Pankration, a single punch didn't just bruise, it decapitated. The sport moved from the sun-drenched stadiums of Olympia into the shadow of the Colosseum. The curse intensified as the athletes were no longer free citizens fighting for honor, but often slaves or gladiators fighting for the amusement of a mob that demanded a body count. The technical finesse of the trachalismos was replaced by the brute force of the metal-clad fist. The diet of these ancient titans also contributed to the myth. While the average Greek citizen lived on a diet of olives, bread, and wine, the Pankratiasts were famous for their anankophagia, compulsory eating. They consumed massive quantities of heavy meat, particularly pork and bull beef, believing that the spirit of the animal would transfer to the fighter. They were the first to understand bulking and cutting. Before a match, they would coat their bodies in a thick mixture of oil and fine dust, known as conis. This wasn't for aesthetics. The dust provided a slight grip on an otherwise slippery, oiled body, and it protected the pores from the sun and the biting wind. After the match, this mixture of oil, sweat, and blood was scraped off with a metal tool called a strigil. This gloios, or scrapings, was actually sold in small vials as a form of medicine, believed to contain the vital essence and strength of the champion. It was a cult of the body, taken to its absolute, most grotesque extreme. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Pankratiast's life was the social paradox. In the city of Croton or Rhodes, a champion was a god. Statues were erected in his honor, his family was exempted from taxes, and he was given a front-row seat at every public event. But the moment he stepped off that pedestal, he was a man who had spent his life learning how to kill with his bare hands. The curse meant that the fighter was always on. His reflexes were so tuned to violence that a sudden movement from a servant or a loud noise at a festival could trigger a lethal response. There is a story of a champion named Theagenes of Thassos, who was said to have won over 1,400 matches. After his death, a rival went to his statue and whipped it in frustration. The bronze statue, as if possessed by the spirit of the fighter, supposedly fell over and crushed the man to death. The city of Thassos, following a bizarre legal code, convicted the statue of murder and threw it into the sea. This legend perfectly captures the Greek view of the Pankratiast. Even their inanimate representations were dangerous. They were a force of nature that the city-state couldn't quite control. Under the Roman influence, the science of the sport also began to incorporate anatomical engineering. Roman doctors, including the famous Galen, who served as a physician to the gladiators, studied the injuries of the Pankratiasts to better understand human anatomy. They saw the results of the pelma, a strike with the sole of the foot to the kidney, and the pinx, a specialized punch to the temple. They documented the way a man's eyes would roll back during a chokeout and how the body would convulse. The sport became a living laboratory for the study of trauma. It was through the broken bodies of these fighters that the ancient world learned about the nervous system and the fragility of the human frame. The curse of the fighter was to be the test subject for the medical advancements of the era. Every broken rib and ruptured organ was a lesson in how the human machine worked and how easily it could be dismantled. As the centuries wore on, the sport began to lose its purity. The introduction of the heisplex, a starting gate for runners, and the professionalization of the athletic guilds meant that the Pankratiast was no longer a warrior citizen, but a career performer. They traveled in troops across the Mediterranean, fighting in agones, or festivals for prize money. The stakes shifted from arete to denarii. This professionalization led to a decline in the total war philosophy of the art. The moves became more showy, designed to please the Roman crowds rather than to end a fight as quickly as possible. But even in this degraded state, the core of Pankration remained lethal. A professional Pankratiast of the 2nd century AD could still kill a man with a single, well-placed palm strike or snap a neck in a matter of seconds. They remained the most dangerous individuals on the planet, carrying the curse of their power through an empire that was increasingly obsessed with the spectacle of death. The curse was no longer just about the fighter, it had infected the audience. The people of the Roman Empire had become addicted to the high-stakes violence of the scamma, demanding ever-increasing levels of brutality until the sport itself became a shadow of the noble, mythic struggle it had once been. The end of the scamma came not with a roar of a champion, but with the scratching of a quill on parchment. By the 4th century AD, the world was changing. The old gods were fading, and the Roman Empire had found a new, singular faith, Christianity. To the early church, the Olympic Games were not a celebration of human potential. They were a demonic ritual, a pagan festival of the flesh that prioritized the glorification of the body over the salvation of the soul. In the year 393 AD, the Emperor Theodosius V issued an edict that effectively extinguished the Olympic flame. He banned all pagan festivals, and with a single stroke of the pen, Pankration was officially dead. The pits were filled in, the gymnasiums were converted into churches or stripped for their marble, and the curse was supposedly buried under the weight of a new, ascetic morality. The most dangerous men on earth were suddenly outlaws, their skills no longer a badge of honor, but a mark of the devil. But you cannot legislate 1,000 years of combat science out of existence. The ghost of the scamma didn't vanish. It simply retreated into the one place where morality has no standing, the battlefield. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the Byzantine Empire rose in the east, the techniques of Pankration were absorbed into the Sylloge Tacticorum, the military manuals of the Byzantine generals. The trachalismos, strangleholds, and akrokeirismos, finger breaks, were no longer for sport. They were for the akeratos, the elite border guards who fought the Persians and the Arabs in the shadows of the Taurus Mountains. The sport had returned to its primal, mythic roots. It was no longer a spectacle for a mob. It was a desperate, ugly secret shared by men who had to survive at all costs. For centuries, the curse lived on in the local folk wrestling of Greece, Turkey, and the Balkans, hidden in village festivals and rural games that the church chose to ignore, provided they didn't involve the ritualized death of the ancient scamma. For nearly 1,500 years, the true nature of Pankration became a myth, a tall tale whispered by historians who looked at broken statues and wondered how a human being could possibly withstand such violence. The curse had become a mystery. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the birth of modern mixed martial arts, that the world began to realize the ancients hadn't been exaggerating. When the first UFC took place in 1993, the marketing called it a new and revolutionary way of fighting. But any scholar of ancient Greece looking at the cage that night would have seen something familiar. They would have seen the kato pankration in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the lactisma in the Muay Thai kicks, and the ano pankration in the wrestling clinches. The world thought it had invented a new sport, but in reality, it had merely rediscovered an old ghost. However, there is a fundamental reason why we can never truly bring back the real Pankration. The modern version of the sport, even the one practiced in international pankration federations today, is a sanitized, regulated shadow of its ancestor. We have weight classes, we have time limits, we have doctors who can stop a fight the moment a man's eye is swollen shut. We have a culture of sportsmanship that demands a fighter stop hitting an opponent the moment they are unconscious. The ancient Greeks would have found this incomprehensible. To them, the curse was that the fight only ended when the spirit left the body or the ego was shattered. In a modern ring, we seek a winner. In the ancient scamma, they sought a survivor. If we were to remove the rules today, to allow the climax execution strikes or the gastrizin organ-rupturing kicks, the sport would be banned again within a week. We are too civilized to handle the raw, unadulterated reality of total power. The curse of the Pankratiast also left a deeper psychological mark on the history of combat. It created the archetype of the warrior outcast, the man who is so good at violence that he becomes a stranger to peace. Throughout history, from the Ronin of Japan to the modern special forces operator returning from a decade of war, we see the same struggle. The techniques of Pankration were designed to rewire the brain, to turn off the empathy and the fear that keep a society stable. Once you have learned how to snap a man's neck in the mud while thousands of people scream for your victory, how do you go back to being a farmer? How do you go back to being a husband or a father? The total power promised by the sport came with a high price, the loss of the normal. The ancients understood this. They worshipped their champions as gods precisely because they knew those men were no longer human. They had crossed a line into the realm of the Bia, the primal force, and there was no coming back. The science of the gloios, the medicinal scrapings of sweat and oil, also speaks to this curse. It shows a society that was obsessed with the physical essence of violence. They believed that by rubbing the sweat of a Pankratiast on their own skin, they could catch a spark of that kratos. It was a form of biological worship, a literal contagion of strength. Today, we do the same thing with our merchandise, our supplements, and our fan culture. We are still addicted to the image of the invincible fighter, but we are too afraid to pay the price that those ancient titans paid. We want the glory without the grit. We want the statue without the cauliflower ears. We have taken the total power of the ancients and turned it into a brand, a lifestyle, a content to be consumed on a screen. As we look at the ruins of the stadium at Olympia today, the silence is heavy with the weight of the curse. The stones are still there, the ones that felt the impact of Arrichion's body and the heat of Sostratus's snapping fingers. They remind us that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary, terrifying things when pushed to the edge. The prokleatie, or curse of Pankration, is the realization that total power is not a gift. It is a burden. It is the understanding that the more lethal you become, the further you move from the heart of humanity. The sport was a curse because it forced the athlete to realize that his body was just a machine of meat and bone, and that machines can be broken in 1,000 different ways. It was a sport that looked into the abyss of human cruelty and called it excellence. In the final analysis, Pankration was the ultimate truth of the ancient world. It didn't lie about the nature of man. It didn't sugarcoat the reality of the struggle. It said, this is what we are. This is what we can do to each other when the rules of civilization are stripped away. The curse is that this truth is still true. It's still there, lurking in the DNA of every fight, every war, and every conflict. We have spent 2,000 years trying to bury it, to rule it out of existence, and to safety it into a game. But the ghost of the scamma still haunts our arenas. It's there in the eyes of a fighter who is too deep in the zone to hear the referee. It's there in the roar of a crowd that is secretly hoping for a climax moment, even if they won't admit it. The curse is that total power is still the most seductive and terrifying thing in the world. We can never truly leave the scamma. We can only choose how we look at it. We can see it as a barbaric relic of a dead world, or we can see it as the most honest mirror ever held up to the human soul. The curse of Pankration is that it remains the all-powerful shadow of our civilization, a reminder that under the suits, the laws, and the screens, we are still the same creatures who once stood in the mud of Olympia, waiting for the signal to destroy or be destroyed. The laurel wreath has long since withered, and the statues have all lost their limbs, but the kratos, the power, remains. It is the eternal, screaming silence of the scamma, a legacy of blood that we can never truly wash away. And perhaps that is the greatest curse of all, that we will always be fascinated by the very thing that has the power to destroy us. The scamma is not a place in history, it is a place in the human heart. And as long as there is a heart, there will be a fight. And as long as there is a fight, the curse of Pankration will continue to whisper its lethal ancient secrets into the ears of anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen.